Okay, we are going to get started. I did turn the recording on. For those who could not make it, they'll be able to see it on YouTube. That seems to be a good place to put it. First of all, I will have comments back to all of you by probably Sunday, doing a voicemail on my comments on your interviews that you've given me so far. So I'll have that back to all of you. And I know some of you still are in the process of doing interviews or getting the information put together. So the main thing is that I have it by the end of the quarter. So I think that's the important thing. So tonight, what I'd like to do now, since we are into the 8th week, now begin to link what you are reading in Gallos, what your teams have been reading and covering. And the interesting thing, again, when you look at this Gallos book, it's an anthology of a lot of the thinkers, leading thinkers, gurus, or whatever you want to call them, around the leadership concept. There's not a lot that the team has to read, a massive amount, but strongly suggests that you do go through the book and take a look at any of the areas that you might find of interest towards your own thinking about leadership in particular. And what I'd like to do tonight is see if we can get into a conversation about what you have discovered from the Gallos reading as it relates to the you. So as I coin this, the question that I really want you to think about is, how does the thinking that you're reading about from these experts in the field of leadership really begin to intersect and interact with the you? So I think that is now, over the next 3 weeks, I want you to kind of begin to think about that in relationship to the fact that what we've done up to this point, and when we look at the you, and you think about it, that again, this entire course is really helping you to do a deep dive into understanding what your awareness of yourself is in relationship to this process in which we call leadership. And that, as Sharma points out, that really the success of your actions as a leader really has more to do with that interplace, who I am, where am I operating from, as opposed to, what we do or how we do it. And if you remember in 800, when we looked at Chris Argyris's work, looking at the idea of espouse theories and then our theories in action, that really our theories in action are focusing really on our inner self, where we're coming from. So I think that becomes important. And then the Gallos book, the readings that you have there are there to see how that rings true to you based upon other people's thinking about the leadership process. So what we were looking at again in relationship to Sharma's point of view is that all successful leadership, and it doesn't matter where the leadership is it at the top, or if you're a classroom teacher, leadership is diffused throughout an organization. And really, as I hope you've been picking up either in the MOOC or in this course, is that it's the quality of my attention and my intention as I function within my role, whatever that role is. So that becomes a organizing principle. And really then, when you think about this idea of leadership, it's how you shape and how you get people to shift their thinking or their attention within an organization so that it responds to any type of situation, whether it be a short-term event or a much larger concept. So again, a short-term event, if you're a classroom teacher, might be a discipline problem Or if you're in higher education, there's a much larger issue we're dealing with now with the nature of how learning is changing in a university level, given the fact that what the technology gives us is much more access to information. And so universities now are being, one might say, threatened, or are being put into a situation where they need to rethink. And then if you've been interacting with the Moog, there's 28,000 people around the world. And when you look at the comments that are coming back, and that Otto's going to pick this up again with 2.0 in the fall, you can see the types of interactions that are beginning to take place and the types of learning communities that are beginning to emerge. So you as a leader then, I think, is important that you're attuned to who you are. And then as he points out, this issue really then is understanding this idea of the blind spot, our deeper dimensions of leadership. What is my blind spot? When I look at things, how do I understand it? Am I downloading from my own habitual patterns of thinking and behavior, which then that leads into understanding those levels that he talks about in relationship to conversation. That helps us to surface what that blind spot might be. So again, you look at this process, and we've gone through this before, but I want you to just think about this as we now begin to move into the Gallos work, that really this is what we're talking about. And this is what I'm hoping that I've been able to create for you is a place where you begin to explore your own source and begin to sort of look at what your belief structures are and see how they are functioning in your role within your work, no matter where you are within that, and then what are the types of results that you produce. So I think that's the heart and soul of why I'm trying to get you to kind of take a deep dive into that, and why, to one extent, I kind of moved you into doing your own personal journaling over this period of time instead of doing a traditional academic paper, because you're doing those in other courses, and I really want you to focus on yourself. So that's why I'm not doing, quote, a lot of traditional processes of looking at what you're doing, but I'm trying to create a place where you take on the responsibility of doing that. So I just want to make sure you understand that particular process. So now, from now on, I'm going to throw up slides, and I'm going to talk it very quickly. But what I'd like you to do now is to get into a conversation about, when you look at this in light of what I've just given you around the you and what you've been exploring in it, how does this material resonate with you, in particularly with these individuals? Now, the first person I'm starting out with is not in the Gallos book. And this individual here is Margaret Wheatley, and she has done quite a bit of work into leadership development. And so if you look at this, so Margaret talks about a good leader is what you see there. So, who's ever watching the NBC News with, could you mute your mic? Good, thank you. So, as you look at this comment and what she says, and remember, she wrote the book Leadership in the New Science. She's done quite a bit of work with the military and getting them to rethink what leadership is all about. How does this play out for you when she talks about this as a leader, that this is what a good leader is?
Dr. Gold, I think creating the environment where people can get past the level 1 and level 2 is really, relates to what she's doing here. Oftentimes in my meetings, if I have an idea or try to kick around an idea, people are dealing with loss, or people are dealing with, they immediately go to, we can't do that, or no, or, oh, that's too much, or I don't have time, or any of that stuff. And the challenge, I think, is when we get to the point where we're sifting through that and getting to the point where we can actually think about how we can and not how we can't.
So now let me ask you a follow-up around that. So what is your role?
I'm a team leader at a school, and so I have about 17 people on my team, and we try to I'm a middle school administrator, and we try to I'm responsible for making the lives of the sixth graders academically and socially, and leading the teachers to try to collaborate and such. Yeah.
So so if I walked in there and asked teachers and gave them this definition, would they say, yes, this is what Matt is all about?
That's a good question. And I think it depends on who you ask.
Yeah. Okay.
I think the ones that are allies, or the ones that are the key players that I have to discuss stuff with individually before I pitch it to the team. Yes. Okay. And I think that many of them can say, well, he tries, but it's just, we don't have, I don't know if they're talking necessarily about me or just giving up the issue, giving what they have.
Okay. And again, the reason I'm asking that question of you, and I'd ask that to all of you, is that, again, that's a way of beginning to question what my source is, to get that type of feedback. So if any of you have been doing any coaching circles, which to one extent your reflective conversation is a form of a coaching circle, that this is the type of question that you need to begin to look at as you look at these ideas that I'm going to throw up at you with the these different slides. But I also want you to think about it in light of, from a personal point of view, as you read through your Gallos material, what this means to you. Any other people, have any comments about what Margaret Wheatley is saying?
Yeah, I'd also offer, Dr. Gold, I come from a business orientation, and two scenarios. So, so I've worked in technology companies all my career, and I've always worked in strategy as well as operations. And I'll give two scenarios. So one, I spent 13 years at AT&T in strategy, and there were two views to the annual business performance. One was the spring strategic outlook, which was a lot of happy talk about what we could do. And then there was the fall commitment view, which usually happened around the end of September when the numbers started showing up and trying to get to the finish line. So two totally different orientations, and actions and behaviors were different as well. The other company I spent a long time with was Cisco Systems. I spent 12 years there. And many people don't know it's a $40 billion company, but it's run on a weekly basis. All around the world, every Monday, by the end of close of business Pacific time, John Chambers would have a number that was produced globally of what they were going to do that week. And then at the end of the week, it was, what'd you do? So the one thread here, I hope you can talk about it, is courage.
Okay.
It takes a lot of courage to stay the course in terms of really looking to expand the team's ability to think beyond sort of the next, I'll call it finish line. So that's it.
So his approach then was to, instead of looking at, and I'm going to say what I'm hearing you say, instead of looking at how we do it quarterly or you do it over a year. His intent was to put the number as a weekly process to keep people engaged in that.
Well, yes, and that's how Cisco, for as long as anyone can remember, always came in about a penny above the expectation for for the profit number on a quarterly basis. But the business is run; it still is on a weekly basis. So this notion of courage, I always thought was really critical to continue to look to elevate the team and embrace a lot of the principles that we've been learning about and talking about when you're in that kind of environment. So that's a business orientation. So.
Yeah, and we'll get to that issue of courage in a slide soon.
Okay.
It's interesting. Okay, cool. Any other comments on this slide before I move on?
Dr. Gould,
yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to echo like Matt's comment earlier. I was in a staff meeting and we were talking about how the teachers always say, oh, our students can't. Whatever PD we roll out or whatever strategy we introduce from the central office, the pushback we get is always our students can't. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about like changing the mindset of the teachers to our students can. And one of our, she is in the central office with us, so she's part of our system. And she said, well, research shows that mindsets can never be changed. Research shows that mindsets can never be changed. And she was adamant about, reinforcing that point. And what I think about when I think about a good leader is someone who can, change those mindsets, especially with, those deep ingrained like cultural mental models, I guess.
Yeah, I would love to know the research. If she says, well, research is, okay, well, tell me what that research is. Because that's kind of an interesting point of view, because I think it was Scientific America, I think I told you guys maybe 2 months ago, was their entire issue was on the concept of mindfulness, which obviously is part of Theory U. And it's showing how the shift in changing one's person's mindset. I mean, Alcohol Anonymous has done that. Weight Watchers is worked upon shaping or shifting a person's mindset. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Examples that I presented to her, and she told me I was absolutely wrong. But anyway, okay, I'm done.
That's good. Okay. Yes. So all right, now let's look at, obviously, this gentleman you should know, that is Ron Heifetz. And this statement that I pulled out here comes from the foreword of this book. Obviously, in 800, we read a lot of Heifetz and Linsky. But again, take a look at, this whole concept. And now I'm thinking about what you just said about that individual, is that really it's how do you get people to foster your adaptive capabilities? So the question I'd ask is, well, if the kids can't do it, how can we help them to do it? So again, I think, when what we've covered in Heifetz. So when you look at this, how does this play out for a lot of you?
Longe da classe, a gente deu no library.
I think for me, that kind of speaks to the idea of finding the people who have, and I can't remember whether it was Fullen or the Heifetz book, but the people who are doing things on the periphery, who are advancing change and being innovative, and pulling them forward so that they can be those experiments and really become that hotbed for innovation and sharing. And I think that for the teacher who really can't see, or the person in a business who really can't see the change, it's not concrete, the opportunity creation. I think Wheatley talked about this. You know, she talks about using opportunities to create the can-do atmosphere, but I think sometimes those opportunities just aren't there, and you almost have to create them as a leader, and you really have to have that lens to find them. And I think really seeking out those visionary people who can help you foster and mobilize the thinking of the rest, you know, taking it from concrete to abstract, from abstract to concrete for them.
So let me ask you the question then, Jen, how do you do that?
I think one of the hardest things is to get teachers to believe, when you find those teachers, I find that they don't have the faith in themselves to see themselves as a model. Or, I mean, we do a lot of, hey, you know, can I bring someone in to see you? And I'm trying to get teachers to facilitate different sessions. They don't feel, I think because they're so isolated, sometimes they feel like they're working in a vacuum. Their only feedback point sometimes is their own, you know, their own observation of their effectiveness. And I think trying to get them to open up and realize that they can be the leaders. So, you know, I tend to do a lot of, you know, just trying to build relationships between one person and one other person to get it started. And we've ended up using teachers to kind of use positive peer pressure in that way. You know, you guys know who's good at this, can you find someone? And that responsiveness has been pretty successful for us. We finally have a teacher-run PD, you know, in February, November, and a lot of it is just, we have a teacher leadership team, and we have them push each other into leadership positions, because sometimes they really doubt their own expertise. And that pushes it a little further than just me going into the classroom and saying, hey, could you? So I think it's a lot of feedback and a lot of relationship building that sort of gets you there over time. So it's certainly a process.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, the language that you're using. It almost, and I'm thinking about, I think what Tracy said about that, you know, the idea about, well, the kids can't do it. Well, your statement about teachers feeling the same way, that they themselves lack a sense of, you know, self-awareness or the ability to do something because of the structure that you were talking about. It's kind of interesting. So if you look at teachers who are feeling that way, just think about how the kids must be feeling within their own environments, you know, that within the teaching environment. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting point.
Yeah, and Dr. Gold, I was, you know, getting to that point in terms of, so, you know, how do you, in that environment, sort of tackle the success horizon or the performance horizon? Because there's got to be some tangible feedback, and you know, so, you know, you'll have people who initially will be on board, but then given the success horizon or performance horizon, you know, may fall off.
Yeah, and Michael, it's interesting to say that, because as you were saying that, I was thinking about the assessment process that outside of education, that we use standardized testing as the framework of how well a teacher is doing. And what that does is it diminishes the possibilities of exploring different types of learning, because then the pressure that the teacher's feeling is, I got to teach to the test. And that's all I'm focusing in on. So it almost becomes a vicious cycle when you think about it, you know, in relationship to trying to develop environments or to create, like you said, you know, I was thinking of your example with Cisco, that he has created this, I'm going to use the word, a learning space that is in a weekly by week performance process, and that the feedback loop is much shorter than, let's say, a semester of looking at how third grade kids do, or a year looking at that. So that the feedback in that environment in Cisco is almost immediate, which allows for myself to reflect upon and to collectively and individually to maybe increase performance from a different point of view.
Yeah. In that environment, of course, you could, you could miss frequently, and then all of that hard work and et cetera would in fact, culminate in something significant. So that's why I was saying it's the pressure of whatever the success horizon is,
Mm-hmm.
and the performance horizon may not be totally aligned.
When you use the word horizon, what do you mean by that?
Well, whether it's monthly, weekly, semester, quarterly, annual, whatever the horizon is.
Okay.
The sun does set at some point in time.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah, it goes down. That's right. I've always thought the sun goes down.
At some point in time, it goes down. So.
Okay. Other thoughts related just to what Heifetz is saying? Okay, I've got to go on to this guy. And then you can jump back into this. So here's a picture of John Kotter. John Kotter obviously wrote the book, My Iceberg is Melting, and books like that. A major guru. He was chapter 1 of the book. And so when you take a look at this, he's really making the distinction that I think Heifetz and Linsky did in 800 about the difference between management and leadership. So, I found it interesting, and I don't know how you did when you look at these two, and I'm going to show you two other before we get into discussion. So he's talking about management as coping with complexity, and leadership is about coping with change. And so what he says is that one manages complexity by planning, budgeting, etc., establishing very detailed steps, targets, or horizons, I might use that word, and allocating the resources to accomplish these plans. And if you're a superintendent or even a building principal, you have a sense of what this is around budget time particularly. But he also then says that one leads an organization by really setting a direction through a vision. And again, this word vision comes up of the future, but you also take a look at the strategies for producing the changes that are needed to achieve the vision. And so when you get into change now you begin to talk about mindset. Now you begin to talk about change, not, both from a structural change possibly. So if you remember in the iceberg, you begin to look at structural change, but what underlies structural change is mindset or mental models. So when you look at Kotter's 2 points of view, how does this, play out for you? And also, the other question is, as you begin to look at these, how do they tie into your readings in the U?
A manager is not always a leader. And I feel like you can manage people, but you may not be a leader. So for example, when they were talking about those quick fixes and they're talking about those surface level, the way of dealing with issues on a surface level, like just plugging the hole or example, putting out fires, I feel like that's more management. And then leadership is about really getting to the root of the cause and like really examining how to change the system versus just changing like the surface, the top of I think about the iceberg model and just like the top of the system.
Okay. Yeah, one thing to remember, and we only touched on them lightly in 800, remember the archetypes. And if you think about fixes that fail, that many times we come up with a single solution to a problem that really demands much more understanding of the deeper structures or mindsets that are at play. So I want to pull you back to some of those tools that you had in 800 of how that plays into particularly what you just said, about that difference between the two.
But I also found that as a leader, as you're stretching the managers forward, the challenge is that initially many of the managers see it as additional complexity.
Mm-hmm.
As you're stretching them forward, they're now trying to learn and adapt to new modes of operation and thinking. And so there is a tug, a taffy tug that
Yep.
there as well.
Well, and that gets into Heifetz and Litsky. Remember, it's the difference of being on the balcony and then on the dance floor, and understanding that dichotomy or the tension between those two.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I always, because I'm in the history world, I'm constantly relating to the past. So this makes me laugh because I feel like when you think about the visionary leaders, you think about the guys that came together and said, okay, we're going to have a revolution. We can see a new future. We have a new vision. And then when you think about the Constitution, they were all the managers. They're like, okay, now we have this freedom. What the heck are we going to do with it? And how is it going to work? And they really try to figure out how to break it down and make it functional and make the complexity simple in a way that was usable and it could work. So it just makes me laugh because it was almost like the vision had to come first, and I had to get an entire country on board. And the visionaries really, and the leaders really have to not just see what's coming, but pull everybody else in. And then the next step is, okay, how do you make it functional and how do you make it work?
Right. And I think what you're hitting is that idea that, when you look at the bottom part of what Cotter's saying around vision, is that vision without, and I'll put it this way, vision without any strategy is just talk. And that when you look at Cotter, but particularly think about Heifetz and Linsky, in their one book, Leadership on the Line, the people they talk about, like Martin Luther King or Gandhi, or any person who has led massive structural reform, always started with a vision, but they also understood the details that were necessary or knew how to get people to put in place those details.
Well, I love when you bring up MLK, it makes me think of the March on Washington.
Mm-hmm.
So the vision was that you have this epic moment and the entire world pays attention. But then you've got, and I'm forgetting the man's name now, and he's like the mastermind behind making that work. Like he was the guy that figured out the strategy for making it work, for showing the world that these people were brilliant citizens and they came into Washington and were out in the same day. So nothing went wrong. I mean, that is an epic strategy that had to be followed to the T, and it worked perfectly. And nobody ever really talks about that aspect of that vision and how they need to work together. So I sometimes think we kind of put the negative on managers, but it's almost like a system of yin and yang, that you have to have the visionaries and the strategy, but they go in hand with the people that are managing and doing that different type of work. And they need to work together as a system, not as one's better than the other. Because I've had a lot of leaders that all they do is vision, and it's a nightmare.
Right. Okay, yeah, excellent point. And it isn't an either or. It's understanding or having an awareness. So, for example, when I was a superintendent of schools, my tendency was to be more towards the visionary process. But what I always had to make sure is that I had people who could carry out structurally or functionally the ideas that I was talking about. And that role, I think, is what's important. The problem that we always run into is that our tendency, and it's what Senge called the hero leader, is that we cannot think about, if you are designated a leader, you have all the answers, because that's what leads into the problems. And that's why we end up with that kind of, like you're saying, this mix this mishmash between, well, here's what a leader does, here's what a manager does. Managers aren't that good, leaders are good, and that's the problem. And we have to be aware of it.
It's a well-defined team that makes something possible.
Yep.
And it's not one person. That's what, I mean, I think that's why we teach history wrong. We teach it as it was Martin Luther King. You know, it was Gandhi. You know, you don't look at the entire system. So we're teaching kids to almost think that these people are superhuman and not attainable.
So if you think about the movie, Blood or Fire in the Blood, and talking about Gandhi in his attempt of organizing the country to be self-sufficient by using that one individual who had a pharmaceutical company, that I think would be an interesting example of what you're talking about. Who was going to say something?
Oh, it's Mike. I was going to say, during my leadership interview, this was an important moment because the individual I was interviewing, we had this discussion about how his team, his direct reporting team, just couldn't seem to get aligned around, the strategy and what we were trying to do. And we had this discussion about the fact that, he in fact is a spatial thinker as well as a linear thinker, and everyone who reports to him is a linear thinker. Mm-hmm. So his frustration had more to do with the fact that he wasn't, getting on the other side of the desk, if you will, and understanding how a linear thinker would process what it was that he was just expecting them to get it like he gets it.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Others. I know there's more out there.
Hi, it's Jack. And thinking about the history points, all those leaders are outstanding, but immediately when we talk about a visionary and then a manager who's sort of put in the place of making that happen, I was thinking of Lenin and Trotsky and how that sort of relationship leads to one thing, which then when you have such a dynamic force for change, you can get a pendulum swinging back and forth and back and forth. So while, I think visionaries are important, in some cases we have to make sure that change is gradual enough to make a lasting impact and doesn't fizzle out after the passions are gone.
Yep, good point.
Hi, it's Ryan. So just to kind of play off what Jack said, just thinking about vision, it's something we talk about a lot in the school where I work. There's a sign, been in our auditorium since the 1920s. It says, where there is no vision, the people perish. Mm-hmm. And unless you're constantly coming back to crystallizing that vision, or recrystallizing almost, using reflection to come back and say, okay, what is our vision? And how are we making progress towards that? Has it changed over the years? Where could we kind of fill some gaps? That vision is definitely going to go stagnant. And, a good leader might be able to readapt to all those changes in vision and might not. I don't know what the differences might be, but I've seen both sides of the fence.
Yeah, and it's interesting because remember one of the things that Peter Sankey always cautioned about was the fact that vision is not in one person. Vision might get started in one person, but it must become a shared entity. And when you begin to think about what Theory U does, when you go down to the left side of the U, where you're letting go to let come, that's where the collective sense of purpose or possibilities of the future emerges. And I think that becomes a very important point because our tendency is, again, the perception of how, particularly in this country, we perceive a leader as having all the answers. And our tendency is, well, it's the leader's vision. A good leader says, no, this is a vision that I have, but I want all of us to kind of commingle the sense of where we want to go and see how we can emerge with a shared sense of the future. which I think is a critical point. I think, Ryan, your point's well taken to think about that. So other points as it relates to Cotter's material here.
One of the things in reading Cotter that it disturbs me, but I find interesting is it almost seems very passive, saying coping instead of predicting and things like that. I just found that very interesting, that a manager copes, and the word cope just seems to me to be sort of not being proactive.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because the tendency, though, is if you look at it from the iceberg point of view, that as I think I said this to you guys in 800, is that the problem with the event level for a lot of people, and the reason why the tool of the iceberg gives you a better sense of leverage to cope with those events. Because what happens to too many people, and I've seen this happen in my own career, not personally, but with people around me a lot of times, is that they get sucked into the event where they begin to drown in the event because they have no coping mechanism to understand how they can develop leverage around that. So I think it becomes a nuance of understanding, how we collectively use our language. So I think your point's well taken when you begin to look at that distinction between it. But a lot of us are trained to know how to cope. But add in Russell Acuff's work, particularly when he talks about that what happens so many times of leadership, and a couple of the articles or the chapters in that book talk about, the difference between problem solving and being able to deal with possibilities of the future. So it's something, I think that we have to look at. And actually, as we get into this next slide, we begin to look at it. And this is the work out of Jim Collins. And this was in chapter 9, those of you who looked at that. And he basically looked at 5 levels that you go through in relationship to leadership. And so it starts out, when you think about a person who gets hired for a leadership position, is that at that level 1, you're generally hiring a person that has the skills. They have the knowledge base. They're able to look at that. And he says that's a normal process that most people go through. And as you start nurturing your development of leadership, Collins basically said then the next one is that if you see a migration towards contributing team member, what starts happening is you learn to work with others. You begin to look at the development of concepts with others, which leads then to that level 3, which he looks at it from the point of view of being able to bring people together so that they're able to function with predetermined objectives. So I'm thinking about the Cisco example, that if there are numbers on a weekly basis, that a competent manager at that particular point of view knows how to get people together to be able to work or to achieve those particular objectives. Whereas as you nurture, and I'm using the word nurture, and your own development, then the effective leader begins to emerge. And here, Collins begins, if you remember, those of you who read that chapter, is that this is where vision becomes a very valuable tool for getting people to reach high performance of standards, a set of standards that drive the organization or the individuals to where they want to go. That to one aspect is what Colin calls the effective leader. And then eventually he moves into what a true executive is. He says that's when you realize that you have humility within your position, but you also have a will that equals to the direction of where the organization is going. So this is another viewpoint of a way of looking at what leadership is from the research that Colin has done on high-performing executives. So the question I want to pose to you as you look at those, and if you read that chapter or this is the first time you're looking at Colin's work, how does that fit into what you've been exploring for the last 7 weeks around the developments in Theory U, around finding source?
Well, I'll say something.
Okay.
Well, with the Sharma work and the Theory U, which is just I've found phenomenal. And I've looked at Colin's work obviously over the years, but I think that my personal experience is that effective leaders are running on 2 parallel tracks. And that is, from an operating standpoint, and then moving, the organization or team in a direction of this vision. But I personally think that you have to run on 2 tracks, because I think earlier someone said some people are just visionaries and then, great strategy and, nothing happens on the performance side. And so the the vision gets tossed aside. So I do think it requires sort of that parallel track or dual track ability or capacity. Maybe capacity is getting at, to be able to run on 2 tracks and moving the team in the direction of the vision and the strategy. But there have to be these operational performance indicators along the way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Others, when you look at Colin's material.
I'm not sure I can agree with this unless I'm misreading it, because it seems as if to get to level 5, we're building on a series of personal capacities that we're then adding one on top of another and on top of another until we get to level 5 executive. But I think we've seen many examples of great or effective leaders who might be incredibly incapable individuals, poor home lives, poor this, poor that. So I'm not sure that you can take these 5 categories and say that they're interdependent on each other. I think that it's the makeup of the person's skill set, their own ideas, learning, education, worldview, perception that creates them as an effective leader or an executive. And it's not sort of this leveled system where a person is built by adding one skill, then the next, then the next. My opinion.
Okay, cool. Good.
The only thing, Jack, I'd say about that is just from a modeling standpoint, looking at folks from a development standpoint, and most organizations do this, many do, I should say, is that there is generally an annual sort of look at whether someone is a 2-step or 3-step potential person. And as I look at this level 5, it kind of fits to that, whether it's right or not. That's not my point, but it's sort of if you have someone who's operating at a contributing team member level very effectively, then it's sort of, could they be a 2-stepper? Could they get to an effective leader with increased development and attention and exposure and experiences and etc. So I'm kind of familiar with this. I'm not sure that it's right or not, but I'm familiar, at least my orientation is that this happens. Should it? I don't know. I'm not making a judgment should it, but I'm just saying it does happen.
Okay, others out there.
Well, I think, and I only have a small comment on this, I think the thing that is confusing for me is that you get to effective leader and then you step up to executive. There are so many people I know that are executives that are not effective leaders. So it's like a title, a job title, the last one, but it doesn't really fit with the other pieces. Like, they're all like positive statements until you get to executive, and I don't know if I read executive as always a positive like line.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because as you think about your own experience and your interactions with that, the thing that's important about level 5 is that humility plus will. And so when you begin to think about what Sharma talks about, and particularly, I don't know how many of you downloaded the 5 interviews from Peter Senge on the Moog. But if you have not, particularly download number 5, because Peter talks about his own life and his development. And when I was looking at this, it was kind of interesting that, and I even think about myself, not in terms of the language of effective leader, executive, or any of that, but the level of where I started out in the 30s, and when I was 30 years of age, that, yeah, I had all the head stuff, but I honestly did not have the heart stuff. So when you think about Sharma talking about open will, open heart, and open mind, that, yeah, I had a lot up here where a lot of leaders or a lot of people who are in the role of leaders, generally level 1 and 2, and possibly 3, have a lot to do with what we call open mind. It's more of rational. It's more of intellectual. What happens is that as you migrate through this and just look at this in terms of the level, and I purposely had it this way because our tendency is, as seems very linear, but it's not. It's highly dynamic. So if you think of effective leader, and when you start moving into the visioning aspects of leadership, now you're moving into open heart. Because what the open heart deals with from Sharma is my ability to be empathetic towards other people, because I can listen to what other people are saying. And then I think when you get to that level 5, that what in his paradigm, what you're talking about, and he accentuates that idea of humility, is that, hey, I'm not, the end all of end all, because I understand that I am only as successful as everyone else in that organization. So I think if you begin to think about it from that point of view, yeah, this is kind of an interesting point of view to look at. But remember, Jack Collins is influential in many organizations, particularly outside of education, in how to nurture effectiveness within an organization. So when you read the Gallos book, you're being exposed to a lot of people who are coming out of the business world and in the world that is not related to education. So I just want you to keep that in mind as you look at that, and particularly watch that 5th video, Peter Senge, because he really begins to talk about himself, of where he is right now, because he is truly a leader in the area of systems thinking worldwide, and how he has, I would put him at a level 5 like nobody's business because of that word humility. So any other points of view around this?
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about is when we listened to Stephen Baum, I think it was, and he was talking about leaders are made by shaping experiences. And I was looking at these levels, and I was just wondering like how that whole idea of shaping experiences fits in. And also when we were listening to the CEO Succession podcast, how it's one of our faults, or one of the things that we're not really focusing on, is cultivating and developing the highly capable individual so that he or she can eventually become the effective leader. And so those are 2 thoughts that just like popped out immediately when I looked at this slide.
Okay. Other points around this slide? Okay, I'm going to do my Ferris Bueller. Anybody? And go to the next slide. Now, here is an interesting area, and this was, I think, chapter 36 in a book. Andre Dubal, where he begins to talk about nurturing the soul of a leader. And if you remember that chapter, I forget if what groups had that chapter, he begins to talk about this sense of spirituality, not religion, but the spiritual side of leadership. And if you think about Charmer, particularly with self to self, and he calls that divide, that spiritual us with myself, and the ability to understand my place in the large collective. I think what I found interesting about this is that what he's recommending is that when you look at what to nurture the soul of leadership, these are the things that he says. So bring these up. So just take a look at these as they come up, and if you remember that, reading that chapter. So, if you look at these now, and then think about what you just saw with some of the other ones, how do these hit you or interact with your own thinking?
Yes, too.
Dr. Gold?
Yes.
For me, this has more of a merge in between the manager and the leadership, because I see just from the words more activity towards the doing and the coping, but also having the strategy with the vision. So for me, this resonates more as a full circle of the quote unquote manager and leader all in one.
Okay.
For me, it's the older I get, the more I resonate with these.
Yeah. That was true.
Yeah. Yeah.
But think about this in relation to level 5 of the last slide when we looked at what Collins is talking about, particularly around humility plus will. And also think about it in light of this development concept of presencing and mindfulness. And if you think about it in terms of absencing and presencing, particularly more hopefulness even in times of difficulty.
I mean, it definitely appeals to presencing from a source point of view, because he puts a lot of emphasis on more confidence in making sure you are aware of yourself, and where you're coming as yourself first, to understand yourself before being able to inspire and have trusting relationship with others.
Yeah, and in that chapter where a lot of this emerges and he runs a business school. I forget the university, but what's interesting about it is that it comes out of a lot of the work with dysfunctional people, depressed people, etc. That when you begin to think about when Sharma talks about the divide between self and self, that he looks at it as a spiritual divide. And again, not in the sense of a religious process, but a sense of who I am, a mindfulness of who I am. And then you look at these, they do resonate quite well. And I do. I wonder if it's a product of age and the end point.
That's worrying.
Yes.
What I don't see is, in my opinion, what's missing here possibly is a little bit of ambition, aggression. Our society that we live in is a competitive one. One business's sale is another business's loss. And so there's a little bit of, while serenity and trust are wonderful things to have, I think a leader also needs to have a bit of ambition.
Okay, that's good. All right, that's an interesting way of looking at this, because if I'm looking at what you just said, that signifies what Sharma calls probably 2.0, 3.0 society that's based upon an economic process that is based on zero sum. And it's interesting. It was just, I don't know if it's a Huffington Post or one of those things. I tweeted this out. Stephen Hawkins said that the number one concern that is going to take us down is our aggressive competitiveness as a species. So I just throwing that out there. Given the complexity of the issues that we're faced with. So if you think about the astronauts again and the overview, and when you look at particularly the Middle East, you look at that from outer space, you see nothing there that says there's any type of divide. Nothing. And so it's up here where the divides come from, and you're right, it's based on that. Now the question is, and Carl Sagan always raised this question, he always wondered if we, because of our DNA, will have the capacity to overcome our aggressiveness. So, and again, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think when you begin, particularly the greater overall serenity and trust, if you look at our present world, is it becoming more serene and trustful, or is it becoming much more aggressive and distrustful?
Distrustful.
And that's something we have to think about. Now, as educators, I want you to think about that in terms of what type of educational system then do we have to think about in terms of nourishing or nurturing the next generation of people to deal with the complexity of issues that we're faced with. Again, it's not to answer it now, but it's just, it becomes that rhetorical question that I think gets to looking at our sense of self, and then how that source affects the way in which I operate with other people on a daily level. And that's why I raise this one, because it's in that section, and then Warren Bennis brings it up again in the next chapter after this one, which I thought was kind of interesting.
One of the more powerful statements for me is, Otto, at the end of just about every mug, he says that all of us have our feet planted on the same earth. It's very powerful for me. What he doesn't say is no one gets out alive. So,
that's true.
Well, unless you go to Mars. But So, it's sort of, this is it. And,
Yeah.
and so to the point you're making, I think that the more of us who can get to the point of this is it, we have to work with where we are and what we have, it is a great starting point.
Yeah, which then, as you read through Gallos, all of those, and you begin to think about it, I want to end with this slide again, is that as he talks about the internal qualities then of leadership have to be around this idea of open mind, open heart, and open will. But the other thing I think is important that he brings up is your own experience with profound change. Whether it be in your childhood or in your present work or whatever, that becomes important. So when you think about that fire that he talks about, how that shaped his entire vision of where he was going, and then his own parents' work as organic farmers in Germany, and how that helped to get him to become much more active from a social point of view. I think we all need to look at, what's our personal experience with profound change. So for me, and I think I've said this to you guys before, is that why I always stayed in education, that the profound change for me was I flunked out of education. And it quite frankly made me a lot angry, because it had nothing to do with my willingness to learn. It had to do with the inability of the system to deal with a person like me. And so, again, we all have to look at where we're coming from in terms of change process and what drives us towards that. And then the last thing he talks about is that I-thou perspective. So, and I can tell you, and this is a product of age, I think, is that and again, I'm just sharing with you myself, my own internal I-thou, is that for me right now is I am extremely concerned about the next generation. And that as an educator, that my role is to create a space to allow you as leaders, developing leaders, to begin to understand what it means to serve the whole. So that's how I think, that's how I look at it. And so when I look at those internal qualities, that's what I'm hoping you will be able to keep developing as you go through this program. That's why it's important. That's why, to me right now, you writing papers and stuff, you're doing enough of that in other classes. What I'm more concerned about for you as individuals is to get into who you are. Because when you come out of this program, I'm hoping that you will be the transition, to lead the next generation of change, no matter what your organization is, whether it's in an educational environment, or if it's in a product producing environment, or if it's an NGO or whatever. So to me, that's what this is all about. So, comments, questions, thought.
So I have a question actually, or maybe just a comment. You mentioned that, or maybe it was Dr. Grant mentioned that Drexel sort of made an effort to incorporate this systems thinking within the university across the board. And you also said that it took you probably past your 30s to get to this place of being at level 4 and 5. It's just on that, and I guess I could talk to you about it on the executive weekend, because I'm looking at my organization and how to incorporate some of these change processes and the source within. And so how sort of getting people to think about this as an organization, and how using how Drexel really adopted this. And I guess it takes for everybody to be on the same page, but that's sort of where I am in that process. So when you talked about the source, it's sort of also looking at what motivates people and their passion, and sort of like, we always wonder what's our purpose, but you also have that same type of thought process within your work environment as well.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent question to think about, because as you were talking about that, I was kind of like saying, wow, I wonder how I fit into that dynamic. And I could tell you, I can remember probably what got me really into this was one time back in the late 70s when I was coming into a school district in Western Pennsylvania. I wrote at that time, it was called the Title 4C project. And that project was to begin to, and I'll use the word, re-educate the entire teaching staff to think differently about teaching using the work of Bruce Joyce. I don't know if any of you remember who Bruce Joyce was, but that probably was the point of what really got me going in relationship to working in a place called school, basically. And so I think about that, and I think that's a very powerful question that you're asking. It's one that we all should play around with. And obviously, as you said on the executive weekend, those of you in Philadelphia, we will explore that in a little bit more detail. Now, with that, let me put something, for those of you who are totally online, what we're going to do is the last week, in week 10, we will have just for the online group, a Zoom meeting where I want to talk about some of these things just from the point of view of the online class. And I also want to talk to, and I'll do this on our Friday night at the executive weekend, I want to talk about what are you experiencing with this mixing of the two on that project, because I want to get feedback. So I'll let you, think about that, because I want to have feedback on that, because I'm going to, in 801, mix the two classes together, and you're going to function in cross class teams as you are going to do your prototyping. So I just want to throw that out to make sure that both groups will have some time to give me feedback on this process of mixing you guys together as we move into 801. And then I also want to talk, to each group separately around just, concepts of what's happened in the class. So, you'll give me a lot of feedback on that night. So I'll let Sunday, when I do my voice announcement, I'll let the online class know when that Zoom will be the last week. So that's it for me right now. I don't know if there's other thoughts. You want to continue talking? If not, you may say goodnight, Gracie, or whoever, or John Boy, or whatever whatever one you want to use. So, but again, I want you, to concentrate on thinking about the Gallos material now in light of what you've been diving into around theory review. So I am going to turn the recording off anyway.